This is the Writers Are People Too podcast, where you might just find that you shouldn't meet the writer of your heroes. Tonight, we have with us a man who, at one time, the authorities probably considered to be the antithesis of a hero. He was on the U.S. Secret Service's most wanted list for defrauding banks up to approximately $25 million, supposedly, among other things. And, I got all the information from Wikipedia, so I apologize if any of it's incorrect.
Oh, sorry.
Matthew Cox. So, Matthew, authors tend to write what they know, and you know crime. So for the benefit of those who are unfamiliar with you, why don't you just give us a brief rundown of some of your escapades?
I owned a mortgage company, and I got in trouble for committing, for wire fraud, and I was placed on probation. And then I started committing crimes, like white collar crimes. I would make fake people, borrow money in their names, that sort of thing. So eventually I was went on the run for 3 years, and I was on the Secret Service's number one on the Secret Service's most wanted list. And I was eventually caught and sent to prison I was given 26 years. I served 13 in federal prison. I'm supposedly responsible for $55 million in loans. $55,000 in mortgage fraud. And that's
Okay.
that's a very short version.
Yeah. And if you want to know more, you should just read his book, Shark in the Housing Pool, which, I went to Amazon and I picked up. And so, you get my $2.50 in royalties or whatever. You're welcome. Thank you for your time.
Nice.
And, I had never actually heard of you until about a week ago. And then we connected on Instagram. So, thank you for coming on. And, your book is very good. And funnily enough, I found myself empathizing with the bad guy the whole time.
Right.
And so, did you ever think of yourself as the bad guy when you were going through this?
Yeah. Like, I wasn't delusional. I didn't think of myself as Robin Hood or anything. It just started off slow. You're changing documents to make sure my clients were getting loans so that I could make a commission. And then when I got in trouble, I started saying, I might as well do this for myself. And I started, created a much larger scam.
Mm-hmm.
And, but I don't think it didn't actually remember. I think I put that in my book, where one of the girls I was committing fraud with said, "Are we bad people?" And I remember saying probably, but it didn't keep me up at night or anything.
Mm-hmm.
Criminals can easily justify pretty much anything.
Mm-hmm. I found a few places where you kind of were justifying some things, like when I think you were stealing toddlers' social security numbers. I think you came up with some justification for that, among other things.
Right.
And as far as I can tell now, you're a responsible businessman between your books and your courses and all that stuff, and your YouTube channel.
We'll see.
Maybe.
Not over.
We're not making any accusations here. But what does it do to the human psyche when you're officially convicted and looked at as a criminal in the eyes of society?
I'm not. I think that I had already, keep in mind, I wasn't just arrested one day. I went on the run. There were articles about me. There were magazine articles. There were 30 or 40 newspaper articles. There were, like, if you read the book, you can see I pull all these quotes out of these newspaper articles. There was Dateline did 2 1-hour specials. I was on American Greed. So there was a bunch of media attention, and none of them were singing my praises. So long before I was convicted, I knew, like, this is not something society is acceptant of. And but to commit fraud, like, you have to be okay with that. You tell yourself, those people don't know me, they don't understand, I'm not hurting anybody, I'm probably inconveniencing some people, but they'll be fine. You just shrug it off.
Mm-hmm. So was it you were kind of doing a quote unquote victimless crime and sticking it to the man the whole time?
I think that's probably, I don't even know that probably was one of the factors, was that I felt like I was defrauding banks and it wasn't a big deal and nobody was really getting hurt. So what does it matter? I used to say that the bank's actuaries have determined that there's a certain amount of money that they lose as a result of fraud every single year. And that money is set aside for people that commit fraud. So I'm just taking what's rightfully mine. Otherwise, the bank's just going to keep that money, and that wouldn't be fair.
Yeah, of course not. Yeah, I mean they put it aside for a rainy day, and you're the rainy day.
Right.
Cool.
So, right.
Yeah. So there were a few places in your book that you mention ethics and morals. At the beginning, you say, "Luckily for me, ethics didn't get in the way of profits." And towards chapter 10, I think you said, "I'm not a fan of identity theft for several reasons, none of them moral." And so, first off, side note, I think your book is hilarious. There are tons of very, witty things you say and sarcastic things you say, and you're just being brutally honest. So I did love that. But my question ultimately is like, what formed your moral framework back then versus now? Because towards the end of the book, spoiler alert, you write an ethics and fraud course as part of your reparations. So like, what was the disconnect between then and now?
Well, I mean, I wrote the ethics and fraud course because I was trying to get my sentence reduced.
Mm-hmm.
But I honestly would say that I probably had, my moral or ethical compass kind of readjusted by my prison sentence. And as a result of that, I ended up writing a book. I ended up writing a memoir. I mean, I wrote a bunch of books, but the big thing was that I wrote my memoir, and as a result, I read multiple books on how to write memoirs and how to write true crime, how to write nonfiction. And one of the things that happened was it's funny because like I had my mom at the time like order several books for me. And then probably the best, and these are, they're 150, well, no, 150. They're more like 200-300 page books, right? I remember I got the like True Crime for Dummies, or writing a memoir for what was it? The Idiot's Guide to Writing Memoirs or something. So I get all these books, and it's funny because all those books are written by great authors. They're really, the title obviously is catchy, but the books are all solid books to read on the subjects. And I ended up having some guy give me a book that was like 100 pages or 90 pages long. It was this little tiny book, and it was written by this woman probably in the 80s or something. And she had written like 2 or 3 memoirs herself. And so she wrote a little book on how to write memoirs. And it was probably the most, and I can't even remember the name of it. Everybody's always like, well, but what was the name of the book? I can't remember. I just remember it had like a sailboat or something on the front of it. And it was tiny. It was this big, it was little, and it was, I'll bet you it wasn't 20,000 words, maybe less. And I read it, and it was just great. It gave all these great insights on how to write. It was about writing memoirs, but really just about writing nonfiction. Talked about looking for those things in your past that help shape the things that you would do in the future, and whether you truly believed it or not. And one of the things was that she was like, because the truth is, like, you wouldn't know if those things shaped you or not, because you're kind of like you're a fish in water, right? Like fish doesn't realize it's in water. It's always been in water. It's surrounded by water. It doesn't understand. So you don't think about air, like, right? You don't think about the damage that's been done to you as a child that helped shape the person you are. Other people might see it, but you certainly don't. So she was like, but look for those things and that will help determine your path in life. And that's one of the things that makes a great memoir. She had all these great insights. And I remember one of the things she had said, which I thought was funny. She was like, don't be too concerned about knowing exactly what happened. If go off of what your recollection of that may, you don't have to say it's fact. She said, I can tell you right now, one of her books, she said, I talked about growing up and how you would hear people say, I walked to school uphill both ways, going and coming to school to catch the bus. to catch the bus. I walked 3 miles, to the uphill both ways to the bus stop to go to school. And she said, so she was in her 30s and she went back to her childhood home. And she said, what felt like 3 miles. She said, and I had said, like, I literally did walk about 3 or 4 miles to the bus stop to catch the bus to go to school. She said, literally was probably no further than a city block. She said, maybe an eighth of a mile. She said, but as a 7 or 8 or 9, 10-year-old kid, she said, it felt like this huge distance. And she said, so, when I wrote that in my book, like, I wasn't lying. That was my perception at the time.
Yeah.
And anyway, so I felt like it was just a great book all the way around. And so yeah, I had read these books and I started writing, and I think that made me take a long look at myself and my upbringing and my decision making and stop justifying. And one of the big things for her too was like that if you've done something, if you've done horrific things or been cruel, then say you were cruel. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with admitting those things. And in many ways, admitting those things will bring the viewer closer to you, because if the viewer starts to like you and you're hard on yourself, they'll come to your defense. So, and I find that all the time. Like I'll do a video, I have a YouTube channel and I'll do videos, and someone will periodically, although most of the people that watch the videos, love me to death. There's every once in a while, there's some guy that's like, this guy's a piece of garbage. He's a horrible human being. And I'll go in and I'll say, you're right. I've done some horrible things. And I totally understand it. And it's probably much worse than you believe. And then other people will come and say, bro, that's not true. What's your problem? This guy went to prison. He's changed his life. They'll start attacking the person. Because now, had I said that exact same thing, people wouldn't come to my defense. They'll come to your defense when you're hard on yourself more than they will when you start trying to deflect and defend yourself. And it's the same thing, I think, in writing, especially writing books. If you're hard on yourself, people that read it, listen, by the time you start being hard on yourself, you're doing things horrible or doing horrible things, people already like you. That's chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5. By chapter 2 or 3, they should already like you. They should be rooting for you.
Yeah. And that's very true. And I do recall what you were saying about writing things from your perspective. I think you put that in your introduction or whatever. You're like, people will argue with me and there's court documents or whatever, but these are the things as I remember them. And so that is very fair, because reality is shaped by our perception. So 100% agree with you there.
Well, and I was going to say, there's nobody to tell the truth. You ever hear that? I love that saying. There's 3 versions of the truth, their version, your version, and the truth. But the truth is, there's only 2 versions. There's their version and your version, because there's nobody there to tell the truth.
Yeah.
There's only, other people's perception. There's no omnipotent God that will come down and say, no, this is exactly what happened. He doesn't do that. It's whatever you think happened and what this person think happened, or maybe it's the victors that tell the truth, but you can never really know exactly the truth. You can never see through everybody's point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. So amid the X-Acto knifing of IDs and the falsifying of documents and forgeries and the moves and the new identities, did you ever think, hey, I'm in over my head? Or were you just like, this is my life, I just have to keep moving forward?
Yeah, that's what I thought. Exactly. This is the path I'm traveling, and I'm just going to stick with it until, I'm going 300 miles an hour, until the wheels come off, until I hit the wall.
Yeah. So final question then about your past life, so to speak, before we get really into your writing. Do old habits die hard?
Oh yeah. People always say, like, oh, do you ever think about it? And I think they expect me to say, oh no, I don't think about it. Or, I think about it all the time. I think about fraud all the time. It's extremely comforting to me to think about it. It's funny. Like when I first got out of prison, I was living in somebody's spare room, and I did that for about 18 months. And I mean, for 18 months, every time I was like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to pay rent. I'm not sure, like, money's not coming in. People, things would happen and somebody doesn't come through with a job, or somebody doesn't come through with a check, or somebody changes their mind and doesn't hire you to do something. At this point, I was painting, and you think you've got so many commissions coming and people suddenly don't do it, or they don't purchase the painting they said they were going to. And so, you get frustrated. Always my first thought was fraud.
Hmm.
If things get so bad that I think I'm going to go under, then I'm just going to commit fraud.
And when you say fraud like that, do you mean you are always on the lookout for opportunities to commit fraud, or were you saying like, I need to go find something to do? Like, did it just come to you, or were you looking
everywhere.
for it?
I'm always, listen, I'm driving down through a neighborhood and I see a house that's in good condition, but I know nobody's lived in that house in 6 months. And my thought process is, where are the owners of that house? Who owns that house? Someone's watching it. Someone's maintaining it. They're mowing the yard. Nobody's lived there for 6 months. Like, that's a perfect house. Or Airbnbs. Like, you hear about Airbnbs and I'm like, what a perfect opportunity for a scam. Like, what a perfect opportunity to, like, these people don't live here. They'll give me access to their house for very little money for a week. And I only need a week. I could borrow, $500,000, $1 million on your house within a week. I mean, I could sell that house within a week. So, or at least get the deposits on it, pay 2 weeks. 2 weeks, I can have that house sold multiple times. So, I mean, that's just an automatic thing. It's just constantly cycling in my head. It doesn't go away. At least it doesn't for me. I'm sure, hopefully for a lot of fraudsters or criminals in general, it goes away, but it doesn't for me. Hasn't. I'll let you know.
So real quick, you mentioned painting. And you didn't write before you went to prison. Is that correct?
I actually did write. I just never published anything. I actually wrote a book. Keep in mind, I'm running a mortgage company with like 10 or 12 guys in it, but it's not a full-time job. And I used to listen to like John Grisham. So I actually wrote a novel, but I never published or anything. Like, it was it was a rough.
Was that the
manuscript.
Associates?
Yes. And I put it in a drawer and I forgot about it and hadn't thought about it in years until suddenly the media started talking about it. He wrote a novel about exactly what he's doing, and it wasn't exactly what I was doing. And it was the character in that novel was as much me as John Grisham's characters are him.
So perhaps bits and pieces. Because we all do write bits and pieces of ourselves, but not exact stories, is what you're saying.
Right. Yeah. Like, are there similarities? There are some similarities, but overall, if you were to read the story and if you were to read Shark in the Housing Pool and you were to read The Associates, you'd be like, oh yeah, this is not the same story.
Would you say John Grisham is your favorite author then?
I don't even know if I have. I mean, I can't pronounce his last name though. Chuck Paholnichuk. He wrote Fight Club.
Polchinski?
Is this?
I don't know.
The guy that wrote he wrote Fight Club. He wrote Choke. He wrote. I have never been able to pronounce his last name.
We're gonna look this up right now.
And I like John Grisham. I like the classics. I like Tom Clancy. I like Nelson DeMille.
Okay. Yeah, even the title that you gave it, The Associates, it does sound very John Grisham. Like, I mean, he's got, like, I think my favorite by him is like The Testament. That one's about the lawyer that has to go down to South America to find the lady that the old guy left all his money to. No spoilers for anybody, but that's a great one if you never read it. Let me see here. So I don't know how to say this. Palahniuk. Chuck Palahniuk. I can't say it either.
Yeah, I would say Paholnichuk or something. I don't know. Anyway, yeah, he's
yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, going back to writing and arts, would you say that you're just a creative person in general? You're always looking for a creative outlet then?
Yeah, my degree's in fine arts. I have a degree from University of South Florida, and so I mean I've always been creative. I mean,
did you look at your fraud as a creative outlet?
I mean, definitely. It was definitely. I mean, I got extremely creative.
Yeah, I think there was this one section where you were naming all your folks after The Simpsons, and I thought that was pretty funny.
Yeah, or they would the synthetic identities would be named like James Red, William Blue, Michael White, Lee Black. That's after the movie Reservoir Dogs. In the movie Reservoir Dogs, Quentin Tarantino, he wrote Pulp Fiction. And he had a series of characters that were robbing a bank, and nobody wanted to go by their name, so they gave them all like Mr. Red, Mr. Pink, Mr. Black, Mr. Yellow, Mr. Green.
Yeah. So I feel like you're writing, or yourself as an author, rather, you matured during your prison sentence, and you were there for 13 years. In the beginning pages of your book, you say, "The truth is, I didn't have a weapon, and the only danger I posed was to financial institutions." So what was prison like for a white collar criminal, and did you feel out of place?
Like a white crawler. Um, what was prison like for? I mean, yeah, it was. I would say. I mean, it was fine. It's like being in a really really rough high school. You know, you keep your head down, keep to yourself, and you're going to be fine. But if you walk around like you're a tough guy, acting like a jerk and talking about people and running up debts or gambling or something, you're going to get yourself in trouble. So, I'm lucky because prisons aren't filled with super intelligent people. There's a very small subsection of individuals that are fairly sharp. And let's face it, if you're just slightly sharp on the outside, you're a genius inside. So, I taught GED classes. I taught classes on how to write essays, I taught the real estate class for, gosh, I think like 12 years, like 10 or 12 years. No, like 12, like 12 years. What else? So I worked in the library. I worked in education. People would come to you and ask you to read their legal work and explain, legal work's not that easy to read, especially if you're somebody who didn't graduate high school. So that sort of thing. So, I mean, I didn't have a really bad time in prison. It wasn't horrible.
The bologna sandwiches didn't suck.
They did suck. I mean, well, they didn't. I like bologna sandwiches. Personally, I don't have a problem with bologna sandwiches. And the food actually was better than I expected. Like, I didn't have any expectations. My expectations of prison were not very high. So when I got in there, I thought they fed us very well. It was very repetitive, and there were some meals that I didn't like, but it's prison. What are you going to do? But boy, some of these guys complained and complained and complained. Everything. It was like, well, when you were robbing banks, or when you were, selling drugs, like, what did you think prison was going to be like? Like, do you think you're going to get there and they're going to serve you great gourmet meals and they're going to treat you well and everyone's going to be respectful? Like, what did you think? So, but some of these guys, they don't, whatever, they're delusional.
Yeah. So while we were texting to set this up, you specifically mentioned that you wanted to discuss the difficulties of writing true crime in prison and how that came about. So how did that come about?
You know what's funny is like, because I'll get these questions. They're like, people think that you have access to a computer. Like, I've got Word and I can write, and I've got a laptop I'm walking around, and you have access to the internet. Like, none of that is happening. I wrote
writing on toilet paper or what?
You're writing on, I would steal, paper, like, whatever, pads of paper from education, which I wasn't supposed to do. I would steal pens from education, which you could get in trouble for, all of which you get in trouble for. I would try and buy pads of paper from commissary, but that was difficult. They don't always have them. They run out, and it's not like it's a huge necessity, for these guys. Most of these guys are more concerned about going on the rec yard than they are about having writing utensils. And I would sit in my cell and I would write, and I think because I was writing true crime, and I'm writing people's memoirs and true crime books, and sometimes just synopses of their actual story. I would always order the Freedom of Information Act. And I figured that out on my case. Like, I had my own documents, but I didn't have everything. And I figured out that you could order the Freedom of Information Act on yourself and on other people. And because a lot of these guys, they didn't know, like, and I certainly didn't know everything about my case. Well, if I want to know, let's say I know what I was doing, but I don't know what the investigators were doing. How do I do that? I cannot go and have a conversation with the FBI agents that are investigating me. I don't know when they got on to my trail. I don't know what tipped them off. I don't know where they're located. I don't know what the names of the agents are, how many were there, what were the tips, what did they do to pursue me. So I ordered the Freedom of Information Act on myself to the FBI, Secret Service, U.S. Marshals, IRS, to everybody. And then it would take months and months. Those reports would start coming in, and they would document what they were doing on their side of the investigation. So then you find out, how did they first get onto my trail, or how were they first notified? And so now I have and they write up a nice little report. So that they got a phone call, or they were contacted by a title agent, who that agent was and what they said and what was going on. And then you're like, oh wow, that was the such and such closing, or that was this, and so this is what happened, and that's why they realized something was wrong. They contacted the FBI, and then that started the investigation. So you start putting all that together, but it takes a long time. And then of course you can order the stuff from the from the U.S. Attorney's Office. You can order your indictments and transcripts and factual stipulations and things of that nature. Your plea agreement, what you agree to, those sorts of things. So all of that helps build a separate story. And you've got the dates. Suddenly you have the dates. I can't tell you how many guys I interviewed, and they have no idea. They don't know anything about their case. Like, they don't know when they got arrested. They don't know. They're like, yeah, so this is when I robbed the bank. And then you get the Freedom of Information Act in, and they're like 2 months off, 6 months off. Like you said, you did it in early 2008. And there's like, that's what I thought. Like, what does it say? And then they go, oh yeah, it must have been. And
well, and so in your book, you name hundreds of addresses and prices and stuff. I'm assuming you got all that information from your own records that you kept, or from the information that was held on you. But how many of those do you distinctly remember, or are they just numbers and addresses on a ledger?
It depends on the transaction. Like, some of them I remember very clearly because things happened. It's like, oh wow, that's the one where this happened. But some of them, if the transaction was uneventful, I have very little recollection of uneventful things. Things that had, things that were shocking, or really burned into my memory. Anything that went wrong, or getting caught, or by the title person, or having a conversation, or having to talk my way out of a situation. Like, I remember those things because it was, I believe, traumatic.
Well, which you seem to be very good at, talking your ways out of situations. I don't recall the exact portion of the book, but it was when you were about to get caught. It seemed like you had to go to the police station afterwards to give your testimony, and you were in the glass room in the bank. I mean, what was going through your head? You were just like, I'm screwed. I'm just going to talk until they arrest me, or like what?
I mean, I'm going to try and talk my way out of it. I'm already in trouble. What am I going to say? Just say, give up? I'm already done. So once I realized very quickly that they didn't know who I was. They believed I was a guy named Gary Sullivan. And so I just ran with that. And I figured, first of all, if they don't know who I am, or I'd be in handcuffs, I'd never get out of these handcuffs. And I convinced them to take the handcuffs off, because I was like, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm not under arrest. I feel like I think they realize, like, if he thinks he's under arrest, he's probably going to ask for a lawyer. So they took the handcuffs off. And then I just kind of spun the information that they had to weave a story that made it seem like something innocent had happened, and this was all a mistake. And that's what I convinced the detective of, that the bank had made a mistake, and that I, in fact, had done nothing wrong. So he took me downtown, let me fill out a police report, and let me go.
That's ballsy, going back in the police station, though.
Well, I didn't go back. Keep in mind, I didn't go back in the police station. He brought me to the police station.
Oh, okay.
Like, I wasn't leaving. Like, it's not like if they had pulled in the parking lot, I could have whipped around and driven off. Like, I was going to get caught. I mean, I'm not, you're in a car. Like, you're not going to outrun a helicopter or the police. Yeah. So I didn't have a choice. I had to go in. And by that point, I felt like I'd pretty convinced him pretty well that I hadn't done anything wrong. He seemed thoroughly convinced. So going to the police station wasn't that big of a deal. Fill out the police report. And he walked me outside, and I got my car, and I left, and I went to a couple more banks and pulled out some more money, and then I left the area.
Yeah.
They figured it out like the next day, I think. They got a call from the FBI saying, "Hey, you've got this guy. We think his name's Matt Cox." And he was like, "Oh," and they showed pictures of me. They were like, "Oh my God."
So how much of this is tied up in your ego? You're just like, I'm so much smarter than the FBI and the cops and all the people. Like, how much of it is your ego, or just walk me through that?
I'd say all of it, right? Like, I mean, it's all just being arrogant and narcissistic and just thinking you're better than everybody else. Or I think I'm definitely at the time felt I was better than everybody else, and they would never catch me. And then every time I talked my way out of a situation, like, yeah, that only made it worse. Not once did you would think you'd go, wow, I got lucky. I'd better straighten up my act. To me, I was like, I'm just that good. They're never going to catch me. So yeah, it didn't help.
Yeah. So going back to your writing in prison, how did you connect with people to write their true crime stories? Were you just like the true crime guy that everyone was like, hey, I want to tell you a story? Or did you like talk to people and then write it for them? Or like tell me about that.
So I was writing my story, and I had kind of at the same time, like when I was finishing up my own book, I'd gotten a literary agent that was representing me. And I was talking about like, hey, because at this point I had, I don't know, how much time did I have left to go? I probably had close to 20, not 20 years. I probably had about 17 years left to go, right? Because I got my sentence reduced twice. So, because I was fighting my case. But so as I'm walking around, either way, I'm going to do a significant amount of time. So I was thinking, like, what am I going to do the rest of the time? Like, I don't want to, I'm not interested. I'm too short to play basketball. I don't want to learn how to play the guitar. I don't want to learn horticulture and, Votech. Like, there's nothing I want to do here that's taking up my time. And I thought, I do like writing. And I'd written my book. I was finishing it up. And I was talking to people saying, it'd be interesting to start writing guys' stories. So I kind of started talking to one or two people like, hey, your story would be pretty cool. But just at the same time this was happening, I had read an article that had shown up in Rolling Stone magazine about a guy named Ephraim Deveroli. Ephraim Deveroli, did you ever see the movie War Dogs?
I did not. Is that with Nicolas Cage? Or
no,
that's Lord of War.
That's Lord of War. Okay. So there was a movie called War Dogs, which had Jonah Hill in it and Miles Teller.
I think I've seen a scene from that where he's going to go buy drugs, and then the guy keeps the cash, and he walks out with an AR after that or something.
Right.
Yeah.
So exactly. So it was basically about a bunch of kids, or about these two kids that were kind of stoners, and they end up getting a contract to supply the Afghan security forces with munitions. So they end up getting in trouble because the munitions that they're buying are Chinese munitions, and you're not allowed to buy Chinese munitions. And they figure that out, and they kind of try and hide the fact, so they end up getting charged. But what ends up happening is I'd read a Rolling Stone article about it, and then one day I'm standing in line, and a buddy of mine said, hey, that Rolling Stone article you read that he had given me? And I was like, yeah. He was, the guy's right over there. And I went, what? He goes, yeah, he got here like 2 days ago. I was like, oh my God. So I went up to him in the recreation yard. I said, hey, he was working out or jogging or something. And I said, hey, my name's Matt. By the way, I said, I'm here for whatever. I said, I just wrote a book, and I have a literary agent. I'm finishing up, edits on my book. And I said, you've got a great story. I read that article, and you ought to think about writing a memoir or something. And he's like, yeah, he told me he was ADHD and bipolar, and he said I'd never be able to finish it. I couldn't possibly complete it. And I said, well, if you want, I could help you write like an outline, and you could send it to somebody. I said, obviously, you still have money on the street. You could hire somebody for $15,000 or $25,000 to write your memoir just off of a really solid outline. And he goes, yeah, I'll think about it. And he walked off. And like a week or two later, I passed him. It's a big complex. You don't see people all the time, the same people. But so I'm walking by him and he's like, "Hey, still thinking about it?" And I was like, "All right." And then, 2 weeks later, a month later, so like this went on for like 3 or 4 months, maybe 6 months. And he came up one day, he saw me, he came up to me, he said, "Hey, you know that article in Rolling Stone?" And I went, "Right." He said, "That article was optioned and they're going to make a movie about my life." Now, the article wasn't told from Deveroli's perspective. It was told from the character played by Miles Teller, which is David Packhouse's version. So, I went, and listen, the article does not make Deveroli sound good. And at this time, I didn't realize, what a scumbag he is. So I just looked at him and I was like, he's like, "Pretty cool, right?" And I went, "You seem like a smart guy." And he was like, "Right." And I went, "You're going to oh, and by the way, the people that bought it were the guys that make the Hangover movies." And I said, "You're going to let Todd Phillips make a comedy about your story told from your business partner's perspective that hates your guts and makes you sound like a scumbag." And I went, you're the main guy." I said, "You could sell you could sell the rights to your own story, write your own memoir, sell it, and probably get a movie made." I said, "But you don't want to spend a few hours a week to write an outline." I said, "You understand that they're going to make a movie called Dude, Where's My Hand Grenade?" And you're going to be a laughingstock. You're going to be Spicoli from Fast Time at Ridgemont High. You're going to be a laughingstock because you don't want to spend a couple hours working on an outline. Like, it's been 6 months. And he was like, "Bro, when can we start, man?" I was like, "You got to go. Like, think about it. You have to go back out in the real world." He had a very short sentence. He had like 6 years. He's going to be out in like 4 years, 3 years. You're going to be out in a few years. You want every time you introduce yourself, like, "Hey, my name's Ephraim Deveroli," and guys are like, "Oh, like that, like the guy on that movie." I mean, I don't want that.
Yeah.
And he was like, "Holy shit!" He was like, "Whoa, let's do an outline. When can we start?" So we wrote our outline. As we wrote it, he ended up asking to write my book, or to read. Sorry, he ended up asking to read my book. Sorry, I'm usually in bed by 8. It was like almost 8 o'clock. I'm exhausted.
Sorry
I've been
for
up
keeping
since
you
like
up then.
3 or 4 in the morning. So he said, yeah, he was like, "Let me read. Can I read your book?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure." So I gave him my manuscript and he read it. And 3-4 days later, he comes back and he said, "Bro," he's like, that's the most amazing thing I've ever written in my life. That's exactly what I want." Like, you don't understand. He's like, I like, it was great. And I was like, "Okay." And he said, "Can you write my book?" And I was like, "I'm not really a professional. You could get a professional writer." And he goes, "No, you are a professional writer." Because that was amazing. And I was like, okay. So I said, okay. So I wrote his memoir and we got a literary agent. And then after that was finished, like, I won't get into that. It ended up being a disaster, not because of the book, but because of Deveroli.
Just to clarify, this book is called Once a Gun Runner, right?
Yes. Once a Gun Runner.
Okay.
And so as that was finishing up, another guy approached me. And keep in mind, writing for Deveroli was easy because Deveroli had like 10 or 15 boxes of his discovery, underneath his bed. So anything, and he had this memory it was amazing. I mean, he knew almost every single date of every event that's ever happened. So he was an extremely intelligent guy. For all of his faults, the one thing you can't say is that he's an idiot. I mean, he was so bright. And so it was very easy to write that outline, compared to most outlines. And I had all of the material at my fingertips. So once that project was by the time that's completed, other people are now approaching me. "Hey, man, I saw you're writing Deveroli's memoir. Like, let me tell you my story." And I'm like, "Okay, well, meet me in the library at 11 o'clock or at 10 o'clock on Saturday." And then they'd sit down with me and tell me their story. And sometimes you're like, like, I get it, but
is it marketable?
Yeah, like, you're in here for crack, and you were raising the projects, and your mom was a prostitute, and your dad was in jail, and all your cousins sold drugs and you ended up getting into it because you were just in a bad spot and the DEA lied about what happened and then blah, blah, blah. And, you're like, it's a tragedy and it's sad, but it's not unique. That story's been told 1,000 times. So, what's unique about it? So I had access to the people that most reporters would die to have access to. I mean, I'm getting told stories by everybody that thinks they have a good story, and I'm able to cherry pick. Most of these guys, if just one of them went up and talked to you, you'd be like, oh my God, that's a movie. That's amazing. What a great story. But I was able to look at, I'm talking to every other day. I'm talking to somebody. I'm like, it's good. It's just not for me. I'm not that interested in drug stories unless there's something super unique about it. And you've got a run-of-the-mill drug story. Like I could throw a rock and skip it off of 6 guys, in the rec yard that have that same almost exact story. Anyway, I get contacted by this kid, Doug Dodd. He's pleading with me to talk to him. So I talked to him and he asked me if I'll write his story. And him and his high school, it's a bunch of high schoolers that were all on the wrestling team, like these 5 good friends that were on the wrestling team. Clean-cut white kids that they start taking oxys and selling oxys, and then they start doctor shopping. Right? You know what doctor shopping is?
I don't.
So they start going to doctors, and they figured out how to fake the MRI, so they could give them an MRI, and it looked like they had a certain issue, like a curvature of the spine and a separation of discs, just by holding their. Anyway, the point is that they were able to fake the MRIs and convince the doctor that they needed oxycodone, and they would get them to give them the oxycodone prescriptions. So a pill's like $1. But on the street, that same pill goes for $40, $30, $20. And so for maybe some of these pills are like 30 cents. So for $1,000 in pills, you've got yourself $8,000 worth of pills you could sell on the street.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what, and keep in mind, that's what they would do. So they would go from doctor to doctor to doctor to doctor before they had the system they have now. And they would just keep getting prescriptions, and they just go to different pharmacies and they get the scripts. And before you know it, they're selling $100,000 worth of pills, $200,000 worth of pills a month. Jeez. So I write that story. I end up, I end up writing it wasn't a book at first. At first it was a synopsis. I contact a bunch of reporters for multiple magazines, Wired, Esquire, GQ, and one of the guys, well, a couple of them came back and were interested, but one guy was interested, and he agreed to write an article about the story. And he said, I put him in contact with Doug Dodd, because I told Dodd, if I could get you some coverage, because you have no coverage. If I can get you some coverage, I like the story because it's very unique, right? Because once these guys graduate high school, they go to different colleges and they start shipping the packages. One guy stays and keeps doctor shopping, and he starts sending packages to universities all over the U.S. And so now they've got a whole, trafficking distribution network, and they bring in other people. It was super interesting. Anyway, the point is I hook up with this reporter. We write an article for Rolling Stone magazine, and we option the life rights for this kid's story. I then get a book deal, and I write his memoir, and it's called Generation Oxy. And so we option his life rights, and it gets picked up by Warner Brothers. By this point now, and keep in mind, so now I'm in an article, so I get this kid in an article, and comes out in Rolling Stone magazine, and people are walking around the compound with the article going, holy shit, my name's in the article, his name's in the article. Like, they're like, oh my God, bro, I can't believe this. And then of course I'm still walking around writing the manuscript. So people are saying, this is amazing. So now guys are really coming up to me. Man, I got a great story. You got to hear my story. You got to hear my story. So I kind of started put people in the queue and started writing their books. And then I started realizing you don't really have to write a whole book to option the life rights of an individual. You can just write a synopsis. because there was a I don't want to call it I guess a magazine, an online magazine that came out called Epic Magazine, or I think there's another one, Medium Magazine or something. And it came out, and all this guy's doing is writing really long true crime articles and posting it on his magazine and optioning them. So I thought I could probably do that from prison. Like, I just was a part of this option. And then, of course, they write me a check, right? Like, I'm getting checks for this. I'm getting checks for an advance to write a book. I'm getting paid from the option. So I've got money coming in. I'm ordering Freedom of Information Acts. I've got guys lining up to talk to me. I'm writing multiple stories. So I would write one story and then I would put it on my website. Write another story, put it on my website. And then sometimes I'd write a story and say, well, I'm going to turn this into a book. And I'd write out an entire book. And that's kind of, it evolved. And that's what I did probably the last 7 or 8 years of my incarceration.
Wow. Yeah, I feel like you're basically an entrepreneurial opportunist. You just like,
right.
There's a
exactly.
need. I'm just going to fill the need.
Right.
In the case of the banks, I need to take their money that they set aside. In the case of writing, I just need to tell these people stories.
Right.
How many books? I'm on Amazon right now. I see a few. I see It's Insanity. I think you wrote that one. I see Once a Gun Runner. How many did you write in total?
I think there's 7 of them.
Okay.
So it might be 8. So 7 or 8 books. Only one of them is nonfiction. Everything else is, I'm sorry, only one of them is a fiction book, and all the others are nonfiction. Okay. And there's a couple memoirs. Everything else is true crime. And I've written 22 synopses of stories. So the problem is a lot of the synopses ended up being a book. So there's like a synopsis of the story that's maybe 8,000 or 9,000 words. And then there's a 70,000 word book also, because almost everything starts off as a synopsis for me.
Yeah. I think you've mentioned a few times that you have dyslexia. Is that correct?
Yes.
How difficult is it for you to write with dyslexia? Is this just an extra challenge to overcome?
Well, in prison, I would write on, legal pads, right? Like I get a legal pad somehow or another, and I'd start writing the stories. Once I wrote the stories, I would go onto the computer system. They have a system called TrueLinks, which allows you to email people. So, but you can't search. It's like just being able to go into your email. That's it. So but they had a draft. So I was able to write in the draft and save things in the draft, and I could print that out on the computer. Then I would go around and give it to people in the prison to read. So my dyslexia is an issue, but it's really just spelling that I have a problem with. So I would just hand out multiple chapters to 2 or 3 people, and then they would give it back to me, and that was my word processing. Was handing it to, there were a couple guys there from NASA. There were guys there. There were college professors there. There were high school teachers. There's just regular people. And I would just walk up and say, hey, man, can you read something for me? Yeah, Matt, give it to me. And they'd read it, and I'd make corrections. I'd make corrections in the draft. And when I got it to a point where I thought it was pretty good and the book was completed, I'd email it to someone on the street. They'd print out the entire book, and now I have a book. So that was the other inmates were my word processor.
Always the entrepreneur. You're just hiring other people, right? So I talk to authors all the time. I think you're coming up. I think you're probably around author 70 or so that I'm interviewing. Okay. And when I talk to the authors, they write the characters, but in this case, you are the character. So it's kind of a strange feeling that I've read this book about you, that I know so much about you, and you know next to nothing about me. That's just like a weird dynamic. But I think there's a few things that make up a good book. And in your book, there's sex and there's money and there's living on the edge. You always keep referring to yourself as James Bond and stuff. And I think all those make it a great story. But I think one other thing that makes a great story is a redemption arc. So do you see yourself as having a redemption arc from the start to the end? And like, do you see a story of atonement in your life?
I don't. But people do. I get it all the time. The first few times I heard it, it just seemed weird. Like I don't think this person understands what's going on here. But I hear it so much now that, and I think part of it is because I'm not making an effort to make it a story of redemption. That it's like, look, this is what I did. I went to prison. You know, I don't want to behave that way. I don't want to be that person, and I need to put my life back together again. And you know, I want to try and do that in the right way. And here's how I'm going to go about doing it. I have a plan, and I don't even know that I have a plan. I have a goal, and every day I'm working to meet that goal. You know, the plan isn't exactly set. It's just evolving as I go. And as a result of that, people continue to say, like, bro, you know, your story's so inspiring. You know, I love the things that you're doing, and you know, you make me realize that anything's possible. And there's all these things that I'm thinking, well, I'm not making that attempt at all. It's just happening. People are just seeing that in me, but I really think they're just seeing in themselves something, that they're rooting for me. Maybe they're rooting for themselves, and they're looking at me as being somebody who, you know, if he can do it, I can do it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that honest answer. Let's see here. You know, after reading the book and, you know, seeing your projects, your writing and your YouTube channel and stuff, you have a large drive and you're intelligent. I think you could have been successful at anything. And I know you had some arguments against that in your book. But what would you say to an intelligent, driven, and possibly misguided younger person who is in your place 20 or so years ago?
Well, I mean, you know, it's not worth it. You know, like you ever hear those guys who, you know, I don't know how many people, you know, that went to prison, but if you watch YouTube, they're all over the place. And they're always, not always, but most of the time, they'll say stuff like, you know, well, I wouldn't change anything because it made me the man I am today. And it's like, stop it, bro. Like, are you serious? Like, you did 10 years, or you did 15 years, or you weren't a part of your family's life, you know, so obviously, like, I would change everything, because it's definitely not worth it. It's not worth it. It's eventually you get caught, you hurt everybody that you probably told yourself you were doing it for. Does that make sense? Like, people justify, I'm going to go in the bank because I need the money to take care of my kids. And really, because you're going to get caught. And, you know, maybe you get away with this one, or maybe even worse, you get away with this one, and in 6 months it catches up with you. You know, you go to jail for 3 years for what? You know, if you know, I want to take care of my family. Well, if you want to take care of your family and you want to be an example to your kids, then explain to your kids that you're struggling and you have to get a second job. You know, because that's what a man does. He gets 2 jobs. He works 80 hours a week. You have to move out of the big house, or you have to sell your car and take the bus, or you have to, why? Because things are hard. You know, I could go rob a bank and possibly end up in jail, and you'd end up in foster care. That's not the, you know, that's the road that your little buddy Jimmy's dad took, and now he visits him in prison every 2 weeks. You see what I'm saying? Like,
yeah,
you have to make those hard choices. And I think committing crime was the easy choice. And it was stupid, and it wasn't worth it. And in the end, it wasn't worth it. And, you know, despite, you know, even if you said, hey, let's remove the fact that, you know, you harmed society and the victims, and, you know, because telling that to a criminal is useless. That doesn't bother me at all. Right? Like, that's not affecting me. So if you talk to a criminal, what you need to say is, you're going to hurt your family and you're going to lose everything. And when you get out, you're starting from scratch, and now you're a felon, which is 10 times worse. You think it's hard now? Get out of prison at 50 as a felony, or with a felony, or in my case, with 20 felonies, you know, and articles about what you did. Now try and start. So I just think that it's not worth it. Like, work harder. You know, if you want to say be a man, then be a man. Go get a second job. Stop making excuses. Go work the labor pool. Like, don't tell me, oh, I can't get a job. Stop, or you can get a job. You can get a job at McDonald's. You can get a job laying drywall. You can get a job as a carpenter. You can get a job, work for a week for free to try and learn the craft. Put in the applications. Like, you can figure it out. Like, wake up on time, go to the job, be enthusiastic. Like, that's what a real man does. And don't justify committing crimes, because in the end it's not worth it, and you'll lose everything, and it's not worth it.
Yeah. Wise words. And I think all of that sums up, again, what I see in you, which is an incredible work ethic. Even if you were doing things against the law, you still had an incredible work ethic. Like, you were just grinding every day. And so I heard this quote one time, to paraphrase, that people who are successful, they often have like an inferiority complex and a huge ego and something to prove, and also the incredible work ethic that I just mentioned. And so my final question for you is, what is your secret to success? Because I look at you and I do see success. Is it a mixture of those personality traits? Is it good luck? Is it just banging your head against the wall until you get it right?
I think it's all four of those. Like, I have an inferiority complex. I have a huge ego, definitely trying to prove something. I always say, like, every bad decision I've ever made was based on arrogance, on just being arrogant and obnoxious, and just making a stupid decision because there are so many examples. But I do love to work. I do have, like, I don't like people. I always kills me when people say, "Oh, if I won the lottery, I'd go quit my job." Okay, well, what are you going to do in 2 weeks?
Yeah.
Like, I don't think people don't take 2 weeks vacation because that's all they can afford. People take 2 weeks vacation because after that, it's like, what else am I going to do? Like, maybe you could travel for 3 to 6 months, but that's going to get old. Like, I enjoy working, and so I have a very good work ethic. I'm creative. I have a good work ethic, but I definitely have a inferiority complex and chip on my shoulder, and all of it. And then you'd think, like, knowing that would help. It doesn't.
And, tying it all back to writing, I often think that too. I'm like, what if I did win it big? What if my book became a New York Times bestseller and got made into a movie and all this stuff, and I never had to work again? What would I do? And it always comes back to, I would probably still write and tell people stories.
Yeah,
just because that's what
great.
I love.
It's great. It's a great creative endeavor, right? Like, it's like, somebody was asking me, like, what is that? Well, why do you do it? Why do you? And I'm like, on a micro scale, you know what it's like? Do you mow your own yard? And guys are like, yeah. I'm like, it's like mowing the yard sucks, right? Like, it's not fun. And they're like, well, yeah, it's sweaty and it's hot and it's, yeah. I'm like, but when you're done and you look back, do you ever always look back at the yard? Everybody does.
Yeah.
And you have that moment of pride.
Same thing with working out.
Right. That's what I do, only over the course of 6 months or a year or 3 months or whatever time frame that, like, you get to look back and go, wow. Like, you know what I'm saying? That's like, man, that looks good. But it's 10 times better than that. 10 times better.
Awesome. Well, I think we've run out of time today. I really appreciate you coming on. Any final comments?
No, I appreciate you contacting me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will put links to your channel and all your books in the description. People can find you. I'm sure they're going to be very entertained by all of your content. Well, so everybody, we had Matthew B. Cox.